Infaernum is a rules-light, narrative-driven tabletop RPG that puts you in the final week of the world before its grisly end, an end which is mostly derived from the imagery and symbology of the Book of Revelation. Its visual presentation owes a lot to Pelle Nilsson and Johan Noor's work in Mork Borg, in that it's very brash and skater mag-like, and indeed the rules are light and fast like Mork Borg. But it's important to note up front here that the rules are actually pretty radically different from the OSR approach of Mork Borg, and the setting and rules options leaves a wide open sandbox for GMs and players. This game has a very interesting history. It actually started as a multi-award-winning Brazilian RPG that was a crowdfunding success during the pandemic, in particular because of the solo and co-op play options. The original version of the game only contained the core rules, but over time, the authors created multiple brochures that expanded the gameplay with extra rules and options and mechanics. After a couple of years, they decided to collect all the materials in a second edition, which they called the Apocalyptic Edition, which was another crowdfunding success in Brazil. This complete edition is now the one being crowdfunded in the English language and the one you can pledge for now at the time of recording. In this video, I'll be covering a preview document which shows most of what you'll get in the book. The crowdfunding campaign will also include a collector's edition, a deck of cards, and other accessories that I will not be covering in this video. If you want to check those out, I'll leave a link below to the campaign. It's also worth noting that the publisher of this game is Mind's Vision, the same folks who brought you The Legacy of Cthulhu, a game that I reviewed on this channel and which focuses a lot of its design theory around solo and co-op play. I think there's actually going to be a rules crossover between that game and this one, but that's beyond the scope of this video. For now, let's jump into this pre-release version of Infaernum and see what it's all about. So like I mentioned, this game outwardly tracks the end of the world as described in the Christian Bible's New Testament book of Revelation. The world essentially ends over the course of 7 days, with 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and all that. You play as a survivor in those final days, and the game is presented as very solo friendly and in turn co-op friendly, but you can also run it with a GM. According to the authors, you need to be listening to an extreme metal soundtrack during each session. This is probably a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but maybe it isn't, I can't really tell. You just need 3 D6s to play this game, yet it still manages to be somewhat complex. Not in terms of crunch, but in terms of the burden of interpretation. I'll show you how that is in a minute. First things first though, making your character. You roll 3 D6 and add them up to get a general identity here. In case you were wondering, the answer is yes, the authors do give credit and thanks to the Mork Borg guys, because obviously there's a lot of aesthetic borrowing going on here. As far as who your character is, the possibilities are mostly quite vague and open to interpretation, which is the theme of this game's mechanics. What are you better at than most people? This is actually an important feature for your character, and it's referred to as your fortune. Every time your fortune is invoked in a dice roll, it heavily affects the dice outcome. What are you worse at than most people? This is also a super important feature of your PC, and it's called your misfortune, and it has a huge effect on dice rolls as well when it's invoked in a check. What equipment do you carry? This is mostly junk. It's actually called starting junk, so there you have it. What's your blessing? These are magical items and powers. I want to pause here for a minute and discuss the creators' aim with this game. They claim that Infaernum is an apocalypse game where you can plug in any setting you'd like, not just be tied to what is essentially bog standard fantasy, medieval, or Iron Age apocalypse. The thing about that is there are choke points in the rulebook here that sort of force you into that default fantasy setting, such as your list of available blessings here. You'll see it again and again throughout the book. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but let's say, for example, I wanted to run this game on a massive starship instead of in a Euro-biblical centric fantasy realm. Instead of having the 4 horsemen emerge in the final week, it's 4 rogue AI systems that emerge and destroy the ship. Well, the mechanics themselves all support that just fine, but I'd have to homebrew a whole new list of blessings here to make them more sci-fi and apropos to the existence on a starship. That's just some food for thought as we move forward. Well, actually, here's one solution to my alternate setting problem. There's another method of creating a character where you can just come up with your own fortune, misfortune, starting junk, and starting blessing completely out of your imagination. In the example provided in the book here, the character created is a paranormal investigator in the vein of something you might see in a Cthulhu game. There are essentially 3 main kinds of dice rolls that you will make in this game. The first is a yes or no. Roll 1d6 and low is no and high is yes. You can bend the results by adding a +1 or -1 depending on how you feel the outcome should sway. The second kind of roll is for a general idea, and this can apply to anything, a monster description, a scene, an object. To get the inspiration here, you roll 2d6 twice and consult these 2 tables. You end up with a 2-word phrase that has to be interpreted to fit whatever you're looking for. 36 times 36 gives you 1,296 possible phrases here, which can each be interpreted in many ways depending on the context. And finally, we have the main dice resolution mechanic. Despite it taking up a whole page, it's just a few lines of text. Anytime you need to resolve an uncertainty in the game, you roll 3d6. Each one is counted as a doom, or something bad happening as a result. Any 2 or 3 is a neutral event. A 4 or 5 is a deed, which means you do the thing you're trying or wanting to do. And each 6 is a miracle, which is a particularly good thing that happens or plays out in the check. But if you're invoking your fortune in the roll, then any 6s cancel out any 1s. And if you're invoking your character's misfortune in a roll, any 1s cancel out any 6s that were rolled. Here's something kind of odd. If you roll 3 6s on any check at any time, your character dies. I was kind of surprised by this. There's only a 0.46% chance of rolling 3 6s, but as we'll see in a minute, there's a re-roll mechanic in this game, and re-rolling non-6s will drastically increase your chances of this instant death. When you roll dooms, you can pick up temporary negative effects or traits called torments. You can reduce these torments by trying to address them in the fiction and rolling high when attempting to get rid of them. But you're always tracking how many dooms you have rolled, and if your character accumulates 6 dooms, one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse will appear before that character. At that moment, they reset their doom counter but also receive a permanent curse. If that character fills up their doom track to 6 again, the character dies. In other words, the second curse is always death. But remember, rolling a 1 doesn't always automatically mean a doom, because if you're invoking your PC's miracle and also get a 6 on that same roll, then that cancels the 1 that would have been a doom. But this system is still pretty deadly. There's a little bit of nuance to miracles, or when you roll 6s that don't get canceled out. They aren't necessarily bound to the intended action in a roll. They can be just anything good in the general scene, or they can be an automatically successful deed given to another player. Which is to say, this game is very narratively driven and almost seems engineered in particular to be optimized for solo and co-op play, where you don't want to be bogged down by hyper-specific rules and adjudications. Any given campaign of Infaernum, at least with the default rules, will only last 6 days in-game. After that, the world unavoidably ends. And at the start of each of these days, you roll 1d6. Depending on the result, your party will pick up 4 to 6 so-called omens. This is a meta currency that the party collectively shares. Anytime a player wants to burn one, it will either reduce an incoming doom by 1 or allow you to reroll 1 die. This is that reroll mechanic I was talking about. If you end up rerolling here and end up with 3 6s, you're dead. But this use of omens is also an important way to massage the results of a roll to your favor. Alright, so here's where the game gets super interesting to me. The underlying rules are a great skeleton of a game, but it's these optional rules where you're going to see a really compelling RPG take shape. I'm not even sure I'd call this first one optional. It seems more like an integral mechanic. The idea behind challenges is that every adversity the character faces, whether it be trying to repair a wagon or destroy a fortress or kill a monster, there is a challenge rating assigned to that task, and characters will roll 3d6 in turn to try and whittle down that challenge rating, almost like their hit points. In fact, this would be how the combat system would work. Each 4 or 5 rolled reduces the challenge rating by 1. A miracle reduces the rating by 2. But naturally, the players could roll dooms in the course of their attempts, and pick up torments. And as far as the details of what all their efforts and the blowback looks like, that is all up to the players and GM, if there is one. Another optional rule that I think is pretty important is the idea of just ignoring the last couple of days of the Doomsday Prophecy and just say that the world doesn't necessarily end on day 7. And instead of facing a horseman after accumulating 6 dooms, you can just say some other bad thing gives you your curse. So what do you actually do in this game? Well, the idea is that as the world is ending, there are churches everywhere posting jobs called supplications. These jobs are essentially contract jobs that come in the form of prayers from parishioners, and they can be anything like kill the demon that has taken up residence in our basement, or drive out the source of the village's plague. Naturally, you have to come up with this stuff yourself. The book walks you through some possible discoveries for each of the remaining days, as well as some possible curses from when you encounter one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The horsemen curses are extremely harsh and hyper-biblical. Profuse bleeding, gaping unhealable wounds, that sort of thing. I think the one curse that recurs with each of these horsemen that I would absolutely avoid is the one where your character becomes a tool or herald or soldier of the horsemen. The reason I dropped this one personally is because it takes away player agency. Players should not have their characters suddenly converted into agents of the big bad guys. Here are some extreme curses. Again, I wonder about the practicality of some of these. Losing a limb is definitely going to color your roleplay moving forward. Fallen ones pursue you to battle forever. That can get old. For the famine horsemen, there's the worst leprosy of all. That's rough. Here's one that I actually really like and which feels like a proper curse. A starving fallen one follows you like a shadow. It's necessary to feed it. That's the level of creepy and dark that I wish the rest of these had. The Death Horseman has several great ones. 3 of them pit you against monsters that you have to defeat, and the last one makes you a specter that requires inhabiting the bodies of others to survive. This is actually fleshed out as an optional mechanic later in the book. In the 6th day, you face off against the beast or the dragon or 4 beasts, all based on Revelation 13:2, I guess. It's a little sparse on detail here, I have to admit. Alright, so if you recall at the beginning, I mentioned that this game was originally released in Brazil as a core rulebook and subsequent brochures that added optional rules and mechanics. We have seen a couple of optional mechanics already, but here's the start of those other modular rules. I'll just say from the outset that these extra rules are what makes the game, in my opinion. The first one is souls, specifically being able to collect souls from creatures that you kill. These souls act as a metacurrency that you can then spend to convert a doom into a neutral event or turn a neutral event into a deed. What this essentially means, for better or worse, is that you'll probably never fill up your doom track, which is fine since the doom track would otherwise fill up too fast anyway. Rifts are another huge addition to the game. The idea here is that your party will occasionally come across a gate or portal or entrance into either a distinct physical or supernatural place where they will encounter one or a series of challenges. If they can defeat each of those challenges, they are rewarded with a powerful artifact called a salvation. Salvations cost 2 rolled miracles to use, but should have a very strong effect. The book offers a handful of examples of these artifacts. Funny enough, 4 of these examples are trumpets. Generally speaking, rifts are a great way to introduce variety into the game by way of radically changing the environment and also simplifying PC objectives, if that's something that a session or campaign needs. The rules for a Colossus are pretty innovative and yet again expand the play experience of this game in ways I wasn't expecting. So in any event where PCs have to face a massive enemy, what you can do is place a model or miniature or whatever in the center of the table to represent this so-called Colossus. Then shuffle a deck of cards and place them around the Colossus. Then place miniatures on markers representing PCs over the cards. You then come up with 4 dooms to represent the abilities of this Colossus and assign a suit to each of these. Fighting plays out the same way it would otherwise in Infaernum. Each player rolls 3d6 and counts up dooms, deeds, and miracles. But in this case, if a 1 is rolled, they register the doom on their sheet and then reveal the card on which their character's miniature is standing. The suit will indicate which of the dooms come into play, and the number value of the card will represent the severity of that doom, as it is inflicted on the PC. You can even assign separate challenge numbers to different parts of the Colossus that PCs can whittle down independently of each other, maybe to first disable certain body parts or equipment that it's holding. Then, as a reward for defeating the giant creature, draw a random card for each PC, and they absorb that doom as a ritual, or something they can invoke if they spend 2 miracles in a roll. There are actually 11 more modular rules like these, and they're all really compelling. Lords of Dread is a method of creating a dungeon filled with fantasy monsters and traps. Cults are an option for parties to belong to a mutual group. In other words, you play as the cultists, which is not something that I see very often in RPGs. There's some great guidance on creating monsters. There are paranoias that can be adopted in exchange for reducing one's doom track. These will naturally affect your PC in a strange and annoying way. Territories are essentially a hex crawl mechanic that will allow you to explore a region using a deck of cards. Dominions use a limited deck of cards. The idea here is that you're no longer worried about the end of the world. That has happened already. Instead, you're trying to take back the realm from the 4 horsemen who have since taken up residence and control of the lands. It's a pretty remarkable play option because it subverts the Doomsday theme. It's no longer about a countdown here. It's about waging war against the 4 horsemen, which is naturally a very cool concept. There are a few pages dedicated to helping you convert the game to a cyberpunk setting. I personally would have loved to see more guidance like this for a number of different mainstream settings, including spacefaring sci-fi, urban fantasy, more on 1930s Cthulhu-style urban horror, etc. Here's an option to use exclusively cards in the game instead of dice, as well as several pages on how to use a deck of major arcana tarot cards to generate ideas. Alright, here are my thoughts on the preview of Infaernum by Caio Romero and Raul Rinaldi of Mind's Vision. Could be mistaken for a Mork Borg clone. I hate the fact that people might take one look at this game and think that it's just ripping off Mork Borg. It's undeniable that the aesthetic is cut of the same cloth, and it's doing end of days heavy metal apocalypse stuff, but this game has a much more interesting approach to the play experience that I'll talk about in a minute. Unconsolidated rule set. Due to the publication history of the game, it seems like they tacked on the modular rules instead of working them into the core rulebook. This doesn't really affect the readability of the game too much, but it does a little to have the original fronts and backs of each brochure included in the book. It's a little strange. Requires active creativity. The narrative-centric mechanics where you're constantly having to interpret dooms, torments, deeds, and miracles, as well as most everything about the setting you choose to play in, can be a lot of heavy lifting for some folks. At least there is the default setting of medieval fantasy to fall back on. Open to creativity. This is the game's main value proposition and what distinguishes it from Mork Borg. I like Mork Borg. I've played it multiple times and had a blast, but at its heart, it's really just a rules-light OSR game set in a gritty fantasy European apocalypse. Infaernum's rules allow you to narrate and flourish any aspect of your actions as much as you want, and the door is wide open for reskinning it in other settings, as long as you're in the mood to do the creative lifting. Solo and co-op oriented. You can just tell by the game's softer approach to mechanics that it's got solo and cooperative play in mind. In fact, the author says "death to the false god" multiple times in the book, in which I think he's referring to game masters. Copious modular rules. I think the most interesting thing about that huge collection of optional rules at the end of the book is that any one of them can be left out of the game and it would still function perfectly well. Those optional rules are truly modular, and you can very quickly assemble the exact version of Infaernum that you want. I do have a wish list for this game. I'm not sure if any of this will come to pass, but here's what it is. A clean text-only version of the rules. If the creators follow in the footsteps of the Mork Borg guys, they will eventually release a more accessible, easy to read, easy to reference full document of the game's text. This game is a lot of fun to read the first time, but it's not as fun to reference when you're trying to look something up. A repository for fan-made setting conversions. Mind's Vision has accumulated a lot of fans at this point, and I'm sure that they would be more than willing to create setting conversions for this game if a third-party license were released. Or in the alternative, if the original creators made the alternate setting conversions, that would be really handy too. It's games like this which are at the top of my list when I have a chance to play a one-shot or a game with more casual players, because it's so easy to pick up and understand. Also, as a GM running a game like this, you can focus more on atmosphere and ambience and narrative elements, and less about hit modifiers and armor and encumbrance, if you're into that sort of thing. I've left a link below to where you can check out the crowdfund page for Infaernum. Let me know in the comments what you think about this game and its approach to collaborative storytelling. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.